Hello class, welcome to our lesson today in section 4.1. We're going to be spending a decent amount of time talking about the graphs of sine and cosine. We talked about all 6 graphs the other day, so we want to make sure that we're focusing in on the sine and cosine graphs. Remember, the sine and cosine graphs make these wave functions that have a 2 pi period, and then the amplitude is 1 because it goes up 1 and down 1 from equilibrium. When we want to find amplitudes of all sine and cosine graphs, what we need to look at is the number in front of the sine or cosine, so the coefficient. So that's denoted by the letter A. So the number in front of sine or cosine will tell you how high and how low the graph goes, and that will be used to find the amplitude of the function. So for example here, this is y equals 2 of sine x. Now I used x here, you could use theta, it's irrelevant. It's the same exact equation. The period should be 2 pi. The amplitude, notice the number in front of the sine graph is 2. And so the 0 points are the same. And then it should go, instead of up 1, it's going to go up 2 and then back to 0 and then down 2 and back to 0. You're going to have questions that give you information like on the left side, then you have to find the amplitude, find the period, figure out what the graph looks like. I would suggest figuring out where the starting point is. So here is at the origin, it goes up and down and back, and it takes 2 pi to go through the graph one time. You want to look at the labels to make sure you answer those questions. Other questions may give you the graph, and you have to work backwards. So it might help to have notes of kind of both versions. So have the equation and the graph look together so you can look at those things in order to figure out what the graph really looks like. The next one is a cosine graph, but notice there's a 1/4 out front, so the amplitude is 1/4. So it starts, instead of cosine should start up at 1, it's going to start up at a 4th, go down and back. And notice I circled where one period of the graph would be from, and that would be from 0 to 2 pi still because the period has not been affected. In order to figure out what the period of the graph is, you want to look inside the trig function at the coefficient that's next to the x value. So the amplitude was affecting outside of the function. The period piece will be affected by inside the function. So 2 pi divided by b would be that answer. And b is the number or the coefficient that's next to the x value. So for this graph, it's sine of 2x. So the amplitude is 1 because there's no number in front, so the amplitude is still 1. The period, though, is 2 pi divided by b, and b is 2, so the period now is pi. When you graph an equation like this, what you want to do is say, where should it start and where should it end, and then cut it up into chunks. So this graph of sine should start at 0, 0 still. It should go up, down, and back by the time it hits pi. So from there, I just cut it into fourths. So it starts here, halfway should be 0, and then halfway in between that at pi over 4, it's going to go up 1 and down 1 at 3 pi over 4 because the amplitude is 1. And then it's just a cookie cutter image of that over and over and over again on both sides of the graph. The next one, the amplitude is still 1 because there's no number in front of the sine equation. Now this is where some people have trouble. You could see why someone would say, oh, it's 2 pi divided by 3 because there's a 3 there. But if you struggle with this idea, my suggestion would be, instead of writing it divided by 3, write it as 1/3 out front. So the b value is actually 1/3. And dividing by 1/3 is the same as multiplying by 3, so it's 6 pi is the period. This graph's going to be really extended. My graph paper here can't show all of that piece, but I can get the basic idea. When you're looking on assignments online or in a book, they might change the x-axis labels so that it fits it better. Realize that the sine graph should start at the origin still, which it still does, but then it should go up and back at 3 pi, and then it would really go off the graph that way to 6 pi. I'm just drawing it backwards a little bit, and together that would be the period of the graph. But remember that the divide by 3 should actually make the period larger rather than smaller. Next thing to look at is a negative sign out front. So think about negative signs throughout everything that you've done in mathematics. Negative signs do the opposite. So in graphing, that flips everything over the x-axis. So this blue graph is the 3 sine of x, and this green graph is the flipped version, which is -3. Notice that the period is the same, and the equilibrium spots in the middle where they hit 0 are still the same. It's just instead of going up first, it's going down first in order to figure that graph out. So for this one, this is 4 cosine of x. The amplitude would be 4, the period 2 pi. This doesn't have any negative sign, so it's just the regular cosine graph. Some people struggle with the cosine graph because cosine should start at 1 on the y-axis, and they say, oh, it goes up 4 more to make it at 5. But it's how wide the graph is from equilibrium. So if it's 4, you have to start at 4 rather than 5. Okay, so from equilibrium, I go up 4. The next spot would be back at 0, down 4, back at 0, up 4. But honestly, I would probably look at starting and ending spots first. So it starts here at 0, 4, and should end at pi over, or 2 pi, 4, because the period is still 2 pi. Next graph, amplitude is 5, cosine of 2x. If the amplitude is 5, it needs to go up 5 and down 5. If the period is 2 pi over 2, though, that shrinks it down this way, so it's going to go up and down faster. Notice I put a starting point and an ending point at 5, at 0, 5, and at pi 5 now, not 2 pi, unlike the last one. Notice how this one's a little bit wider. My new graph is a little bit skinnier, but then it's just halfway. It's all about kind of where the halfway point is of those graphs in order to find the answers. The next graph has 3 sine of 4x. The amplitude is 3. The period is 2 pi over the 4 value. So that would be pi over 2. So notice my graph's really shrunk down now. I didn't draw all of it because it would just take a long time to get all the pieces drawn out. So I start at 0, 0 because it's a sine graph this time, and sine always starts at 0, 0 unless it moves up or down somehow. And then it should end at pi over 2, and then it just goes up 3, back to 0, down 3, back to 0. And that's the setup you want for the period and amplitude of this graph. The next one is 3 cosine of pi x. You'll notice that a lot of real-world questions will have something like this, so that when you find the period, it becomes something that's easier to work with, like the number 2, for example, on this, because 2 pi divided by pi would just be 2. The amplitude here is 3 because the number in front is 3. My graph paper is typically with pi's and pi over 2's and things like that, so I couldn't graph this on my graph paper like this. On your homework questions and on other graphs, you'll notice that the x-axis labels will change from things like 2 pi to like 1, 2, and 3. That would work well with this graph situation. It would start up at 3, it would go down, down, back, and up at 3, up to 3 at the x value of 2 because the period is 2. The next one has an x-axis reflection, so that means the graph, instead of starting upward, should start downward. And for cosine, the graph starts off of the x-axis, typically up 1. In this case, it would be up 2 because the amplitude is 2. Notice I didn't say the amplitude is negative 2. It's still an amplitude of 2 when you set this up. It just happens to be, instead of starting up 2, you start down 2. And the period, this is that pi over, or x over 2, which is the same as 1/2 x. So it's 2 pi divided by 1/2, which actually makes it wider and makes it 4 pi. And so from here, I'm starting at negative 2, back to 0, up to 2, halfway, which is 2 pi. And then I would keep going back until I get to 4 pi. I'm out of space on my graph. Online and things like that will be easier to see because they'll show more pieces to the left and right. But then I can always go backwards to figure out what one period of the graph would look like. Okay, that's everything for today. Make sure you write some notes about what the amplitude, how to find the period, how to tell if it's an x-axis reflection. Remember, the homework could go one of 2 ways. Either they give you the equation and say, here's the info, find it, or here's the graph and tell me what's happening. Remember, sine graphs start at the origin, and cosine graphs start up or down somewhere, and then make that kind of S or C looking thing. It's just a wave, and the sine graph should make an up-down movement for one period of the graph. Have a great day, everybody.